Nuclear weapons have had two roles since their first appearance, strategic and tactical. When used strategically, bombs are dropped behind enemy lines, on important cities, industrial areas, large bases and logistic centers. This role was considered the main one, since it is easy and obviously effective to use atomic bombs against large stationary targets behind enemy lines. Everyone had the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki before their eyes. In tactical use, an atomic bomb is dropped directly on enemy troops that are close to their own. In real life, no one has tried this, and the military considers it a difficult task, because it is necessary to choose the right place to strike and act very quickly and competently after it, otherwise there will be no use. An atomic bomb does much less damage to entrenched troops than to a city. Surviving units can prepare to repel an attack, and the consequences of the explosion are as dangerous for their own troops as for the enemy. Understanding these difficulties, in 1954 the Soviet Ministry of Defense decided to test the tactical use of nuclear weapons in practice and conduct exercises in conditions as close as possible to combat. The Totsk training ground in the Orenburg region was chosen, because the lay of the region is very similar to that of Western Europe, which Georgy Zhukov, the army general responsible for the training, believed was the most likely location for the beginning of the Third World War. The operation itself was given the code name Snezhawk, although it is mainly remembered as the Totsk exercises. The exercise involved 45,000 soldiers and 10,000 citizens from local regions. The participants were carefully selected from Soviet military servicemen, informed that they would take part in an exercise with the use of a new kind of weapon, sworn to secrecy, and earned 3 months' salary. The operation was commanded by Marshal of the Soviet Union Georgy Zhukov and initiated by the Soviet Ministry of Defense. The exercise also involved 320 planes, 600 tanks and self-propelled guns, 600 armored personnel carriers, 500 artillery pieces and mortars and 6,000 automobiles and tractors. Soldiers had been arriving for 3 months. There was a lot of work to do. An artificial front was created consisting of 4 enemy defense lines, the main forward front line, the second front line consisting of reserve trenches and 2 additional support lines. Each defense line had bunkers, trenches, pillboxes. The target aiming point was clearly marked on the ground near reserve trenches with a 150-meter rectangle which had a cross in its center, supplemented by chevrons at a distance providing additional visual reference, all these markings being in white. Planners scattered old tanks, planes and other vehicles across the landscape so they could judge the effects of the atomic blast. A few days before the exercises, military delegations from socialist countries, top Soviet military leaders Marshals Alexander Vasilevsky, Konstantin Rokossovsky, Ivan Konev, Rodion Malinovsky began arriving at the village of Totskoye, and the very last to arrive were the head of the atomic project Igor Kurchatov, Defense Minister Nikolai Bulganin and First Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee Nikita Khrushchev. Early in the morning of September 14, 1954, the troops took up their initial positions. The Western troops played the role of defenders and were located 10 to 12 kilometers from the center of the explosion, while the advancing Eastern troops were 5 kilometers away, across the river. For safety reasons, their lead units were withdrawn from the first trench and placed in shelters and cover. At 9:20 a.m., the carrier aircraft, accompanied by 2 Il-28 bombers and 2 MiG-17 fighters, approached the Totskoye training ground. Having made sure that all calculations based on ground reference points were correct, the commander, Major Vasily Yakovlevich Kuderchev, led the aircraft into the designated corridor. Flares were fired as an alarm for all participants to take cover in shelters. The crew commander reported to Zhukov, "I see the object." Zhukov gave the order over the radio, "Complete the task." The answer was, "Covering, dropped." At 9:33 a.m., the crew of the carrier aircraft dropped an atomic bomb weighing up to 5 tons and with a capacity of 40 kilotons at a speed of almost 900 kilometers per hour from an altitude of 8,000 meters. After 45 seconds, an explosion occurred at an altitude of 350 meters from the ground with a deviation of 280 meters northwestern direction. direction from the intended epicenter in the square. At the moment of the rupture of the thick steel shell of the bomb, a loud thunder sound and a blinding flash in the form of a large fireball arose. The resulting super high pressure of several trillion atmospheres compressed the surrounding air space around itself, so a vacuum arose in the center of the ball. At the same time, a super high temperature of 8 to 25,000 degrees was formed with super high disposable penetrating radiating radiation in the air, on the surface and in the ground. The explosive substance in the bomb turned into plasma and flew apart in different directions. Uprooted trees, soil with living vegetation, dust, soot weighing several thousand tons rose up into the resulting vacuum hole from the surface of the ground at the epicenter. The echo of the explosion reached the village houses, cracks appeared in the walls. Windows were blown out in one of the schools in Sorokinsk, 40 kilometers from the test site. The shock wave was so strong. However, only one house, which was located on a hill much closer, was completely burned. Closer to the epicenter, the earth was melted, loosened, shifted, burned and covered with a glassy crust up to 50 centimeters deep of melted sand, reminiscent of ash, crunching underfoot. All trenches, ditches and fortifications, communication passages were completely destroyed. Nothing alive remained. The aftermath of the explosion stunned even seasoned officers. Instead of trees, there were now charred stakes sticking out, tanks melted and pressed into the ground, and the lab animals were reduced to charred carcasses. The results varied with distance from the epicenter, where nothing alive remained. For example, planes parked at a distance of up to 1,800 meters and further remained mostly intact if they were in special covers. Others were partially burned. Animals 2 kilometers from the explosion suffered almost no harm. It was time for the next act. After the explosion, the Westerners started moving to the third defense line. The Easterners began an offensive and played out a real battle of ground troops after a nuclear strike. For minutes later, artillery fire and airstrikes began on the Westerners, since the atomic bomb was dropped on the second line of defense, and the first remained intact. While detonating the nuclear bomb could make for a dramatic climax, it was just the beginning from a tactical point of view. With 2 barrages each lasting 25 minutes, numerous shells, rockets and mortar bombs were fired onto enemy positions. Meanwhile, a large formation composed of 86 Il-28 bombers escorted by 42 MiG-17 fighters appeared overhead at an altitude of 5,000 meters. Armed with 250 kilograms bombs, the Ilyushians were to deliver a conventional aerial bombardment and in all dropped 688 bombs. While performing the mission, because of the need to maintain formation, 39 bombers and 6 fighters had to fly through the mushroom cloud. However, this had no effect on the workings of their engines or instruments, as it was noted. Following the explosion, a Li-2 airplane was put to use on a reconnaissance mission to report the movement of a radioactive cloud produced by the blast. The radioactive cloud was propelled northeast direction by the wind with a speed of 84 km per hour at an altitude of 8,000 meters. On the ground, most dangerous areas were explored and marked by special reconnaissance troops. According to official data, the contamination of the area at a distance of 400 meters from the epicenter 2 hours and 30 minutes after the explosion did not exceed 0.1 Roentgen per hour. Overcoming the contaminated area at an average speed of 5 km per hour, soldiers and officers could receive a radiation dose of about 0.02 Roentgen, and in armored personnel carriers and tanks 4 times less. After the reconnaissance was complete and the Soviet command gained enough information on the level of radiation, the army moved in. At this point, Western troops set up in third defense line and had the task to prevent an eastern breakthrough. The main body of the ground forces went on to the offensive armor and mechanized formations first, though because of obvious tactical requirements, attacking infantry accompanying tanks were dismounted and moved on foot a short distance behind the armor, while second-wave infantry formations following on were transported by trucks. Troops began the offensive, moving forward in several columns. Tanks, armored personnel carriers and infantry advanced slowly, at a speed of about 5 km per hour. The soldiers wore gas masks, protective suits and respirators, special gloves and capes. Aircraft also took an active part in the exercises, supporting the advancing troops with assault raids. The reconnaissance moved ahead, overcoming fires and rubble, and around midday the advance detachment reached the epicenter of the explosion. Soviet troops entered the contaminated area from two sides and moved around the territory in armored personnel carriers, holding a distance of 500 meters from the hypocenter and avoiding the most dangerous areas of the explosion site. After Eastern troops bypassed epicenter, attack on Western defense positions began. At about the same time, near Western defense positions, large amount of TNT explosives simulating atomic explosion were detonated. This was supposed to allow the army to train in the conditions of radioactive contamination of the area. This simulation was created in order to reproduce such a situation as close as possible to reality. Western troops started to retreat as Eastern approached 3rd Defense Line at 1340. No complete cessation of resistance by the enemy was to be expected, and according to the scenario of the exercises, the Westerners, having received a blow by 3rd dummy nuclear bomb, retreated under the cover of smoke screens behind last line. Eastern troops pursued remnants of Western Army and exercises ended when Eastern troops took 4th line. At 4 p.m., after completing all combat missions, the troops were given the all-clear. All units operating in the area of the nuclear explosion underwent sanitization and decontamination. All the officers and men participating in the exercise signed a 25-year pledge not to disclose information regarding what they had taken part in. The Soviets weren't alone in conducting troop exercises with live atomic weapons. 3 years earlier in 1951, the United States conducted a similar though slightly safer and less secretive series of tests under the code name Desert Rock. Only later did both sides of the Cold War realize that they were essentially using nuclear weapons against their own soldiers. The long-term effects of radiation damage were poorly understood at the time, and it was believed that if troops quickly passed the blast area slightly away from the epicenter, nothing terrible would happen to them. In 1994, a memorial sign was installed at the Totskoye test site at the epicenter of the explosion, a stele with bells ringing for all those affected by radiation.